You're watching a lesson on implementing file services. Now, when we say implementing file services, what do we mean by that? Well, I mean basically making data available, right? I mean, that's really what it's all about when you think about it. When it comes down to computer networking, it's about making resources, that are stored in a central location available to all of our clients, or we could say all of the workers, right, in our company. And so implementation of file services has to do with making files and folders, that's one of those resources, making them available to our employees. So in this lesson, we're going to go ahead and see how we would do that. So let's go learn about it now. Okay, so to get things started, I want to point out we are on a member server here in the Global Mantics domain. I have NYMem1, and this is a server that we had used in a previous lesson where we had set up actually a separate volume. And so that's why I want to use this server, because we're going to use that volume to actually take a look at working with file services. So the first thing I want to do is just go into just traditional Explorer. So I'm going to click the Start button on my keyboard here. Takes us into the Start screen. And we should have an entry here for computer. If we didn't, we could just type it in on the keyboard and get to it that way. But since I have it here, I'm just going to click on computer. And boom, it takes us into Explorer, where we can see our computer. We can see our C drive, but we also have this new volume, this E drive, that was created in a previous lesson. Now, I will tell you, if you don't have this and you want to follow along, just go ahead and create a new volume or work with an existing one. Most everything that I'm going to show you here, you could do on pretty much any volume on any computer. So just for the sake of having stuff to work with, I'm going to open up this volume. And in this empty space, I'm going to right-click and create a new folder. And we'll just call this the demo folder. And inside that folder, I'm going to right-click, select New, and I'll do a text document, right, just to create a new file. So I'll call this demo file. Now the reason I created these is because I want to show you something called NTFS permissions, right? This is how we secure this stuff. This is how we take our files and folders and keep them safe. So let's start with the file here. I'm going to take this file and I'm going to right-click on it and I'm going to go to its properties. On the property sheet, I'm going to go to the Security tab. On the Security tab is where you will see what's called an access control list, which is a list of users and groups. And then if you highlight each user or group, and I should say in this case it's all groups, but if you highlight them, down below you can see what the level of permission is that they have to access this particular file. So the users group, for instance, has the ability to read and then read and execute. And I say they have the ability to because you'll notice there's two columns. There's allow and deny. They are allowed to read and execute this file. And it means that they can read the contents of the file, and if this file was an application, they could execute it. If I click on the administrators group, you will see that I have a checkbox for just about everything. I have full control, modify, read and execute, read and write. I can do all of it. So the administrators have full control over this particular file. Now I'm going to show you something in just a little bit here called effective permissions, but there is a concept I need you to understand, and that is that a user, an individual user, could be a member of more than one group. In other words, I could have a user who's a member of the users group and who's a member of the administrators group. As a matter of fact, I'm logged in as a user who is a member of both of those groups right now, right? Because I'm logged in as the domain administrator who is a member of the users group and who is a member of the administrators group. So how do I determine which of these permissions I get? And the rule is that it is the least restrictive permission. Okay, just to be real clear here, the least restrictive, but deny always overrides allow. Okay, so if by being a member of the users group, I get to read and execute, and by being a member of the administrators group, I get full control, which is the less restrictive of the two, right? Which is the least restrictive? And the answer would be full control. Okay, and just to say it the other way around, read and execute would be the more restrictive, right? That's more restrictive. All I can do is read and read and execute. That's all I can do. That's more restrictive. Being able to do full control is less restrictive. Now, I mentioned deny, overriding, allow. If I was the member of another group who also was on this list, and if that group had any deny checkboxes, that checkbox would override any allow checkboxes that I've been given. It doesn't matter if you're the member of 10 groups and they've all been granted full control. Okay, if I had 10 different groups that I was a member of and they all were on this list and they all had a checkbox for full control, allow, and I was a member of one other group that was also on the list and it had a checkbox for deny, that one deny checkbox overrides all 10 of those allow checkboxes. Okay, so the rule is it's the least restrictive permission, but deny overrides all allows. Now, if I want to add permissions to a user or a group, I would click on the edit button. And then that allows me to go ahead and, first of all, if I were to highlight, so if I were to highlight the users group, I could go ahead and say, no, the users group is denied. Look at that. Now, I'm not going to do that because if I do that, I'm suddenly going to lose access to everything because I am a member of this group and the deny would override all the allows. Okay, but that's something I could do. I could make a modification to an existing group. Let me go ahead and hit cancel real quick here. hit edit again. I also want to point out that when you highlight some of these groups, you notice that these checkboxes right here, well, they're grayed out. I don't know if you listen closely. See, I'm actually clicking. I'm clicking on these boxes, but they're not going away. And that's because these permissions are what's called inherited from the parent. Okay, these permissions were inherited from the folder that this file is in, and that folder may have even inherited it from a folder that it's in, and that folder may have inherited it from the drive that it's on. Okay, and we'll look at inheritance in just a moment, but I just want to point out that's why those are grayed out. If I want to add another user or group, I could click add and then go ahead and put in the user or group I want to add. So let's put in sales. I believe we have a sales user group. Let's see here if I click check names. Yeah, there we go. We have the sales users. Created that back in an Active Directory lesson. Click OK. Now the sales users is on the list. Now because this was not inherited, I actually put this on explicitly on this particular file. These checkboxes, although they show up by default, I can now clear them. Okay, this is an option. They're not being inherited. And I can check any boxes I want when deciding what level of access I want to give to the sales users group. Okay, so for now, I'm going to say that we're going to allow modify, which includes read and execute, read and write. Click OK. You'll notice the sales users group is here. We see our checkboxes. Now, what else can we do? Well, if I click on advanced, this takes us into a more advanced view of the users and groups and what level of access they have to this particular file. Now, I mentioned inheritance, and you'll see right here there's a button that says disable inheritance. If I don't want these permissions to come down somewhere else, all right? I don't want these permissions to come down from a parental folder or drive, I can disable the inheritance. Now, before I click the button, I want to show you something. See my users group here, which we were highlighting, and we had read and execute, and we couldn't clear it? It tells you right here, this permission was inherited from the E drive. So it's all the way from the top, from the E drive. Same thing with system and administrators. You'll also notice that administrators were given full control directly, and the reason it was directly is because I am a member of the administrators group, and I'm the actual creator owner of this particular file. That's why that's that way. And then we have the sales users who we just added explicitly, and that's why that has no inheritance. So when I go to disable the inheritance, it's going to ask me, okay, fine. We're not going to inherit from above anymore. But we have some permissions that were previously inherited. What do you want me to do with them? Do you want me to convert those existing inherited permissions and make them explicit for this particular file? And then you can modify it from there, right? If I did that, that means all those permissions will actually carry over. Nothing will change. I just have control over it now. Or do we want to say no, remove them? I don't want those permissions that were sent from above. So let's choose that one and see what happens. Look what happens. All the inherited permissions go away. We're left strictly with these. If I click OK, again, we only have these two groups, but everything is explicit. Now let's jump back here over here to advanced. Let's go ahead and enable inheritance again and click OK. You'll notice everything came back, right? We have our users group, but it's grayed out, of course. Let's go back into advanced and let's disable inheritance again, but this time say convert these permissions into explicit permissions. The stuff doesn't go away. Yeah, we did lose one line, and that's because the administrators were listed as full control not inherited and then full control inherited. Well, we didn't need the line that said full control inherited. If I click OK, everybody's still here, but now boxes aren't grayed out anymore. They are manageable. These are all explicit to this individual file. Now, another thing we can do in the advanced window here is set up auditing. Now, this is something we're not going to go into a lot of detail right here. Auditing is something that you typically would set up through group policy, which is in another lesson that we'll talk about group policy. But if you were to set up object access auditing, it's a two-step process. You enable it through group policy, but then you also have to come over to the individual object that we have here, and we would have to add specific users and groups, or as it says here, principals, and we would choose whether we want to audit the success or failure. In fact, let's do this so this stuff's not grayed out. Let's go ahead and select, and let's put in, well, let's go ahead and use those sales users again. Why not? We know we have that group. And now I can choose whether I want to audit successes and failures, or only the successes or failures. And then what do we want to audit? We want to know if somebody utilized full control permissions, modify permissions, read and execute permissions, read permissions, or write permissions. Now again, not going to go into any real detail here. I'm actually going to hit cancel. Auditing is the idea of just keeping track of what's going on with this particular file. Who's accessing it, when, from where, okay? And so that's how you set that up. But there is also an effective access tab, and this is where you get to choose the effective permissions, right? I mentioned before that a user could be a member of multiple groups, and therefore they will have an effective permission based upon the permissions that were given for each of the groups that they're a member of. If you need help figuring out what their effective permission is, you can select a specific user and even select a device that they would be connecting from, and then it will tell you what their effective permissions are. So this is a handy little tool to help you out if you can't figure it out on your own. Now if I come back here to the permissions tab, if I want to add permissions from this particular window, I can click add. I can select a user or a group. Now we already have the sales user, so let's use, I believe we have a John Smith user. I'm going to put in John, check names. Yeah, there's John Smith. Click OK. And I can choose what level of permission. Now you might be thinking to yourself, yay, how is this different than what we did before? It's not. The reason we have this advanced window here is there's a couple things. Well, first of all, we have advanced permissions. So we can click on that, and we see that there are much more detailed versions of the permissions. So we can get a little bit more explicit with our permissions. But we can also, and this is brand new to Windows Server 2012, and I personally believe, and I don't think I'm alone, I think a lot of people I've come across who agree with me, that this is long overdue. NTFS permissions just became that much more powerful because we can add a condition to limit access. And it says the principal will be granted the specified permission only if certain conditions are met. So besides, and let me go back to basic permissions, besides saying that John Smith can have, let's check one more box here. We'll say read and write permission to this particular file. We can add a condition. And not only can we add one condition, we can add multiple conditions. And not only can you have multiple conditions, but these conditions can be an and or could be an or. So you could set up conditions and say only if both conditions are met will a user have access to the file. Or we could say, hey, if this condition or this condition is met, will we give access to the file. So this is actually pretty cool. Okay, this is very cool stuff. A lot of playing around we can do here, but this is a huge but here. Be careful. I mean, you're messing around with security, or you're messing around with access. Make sure you play around with this in a test environment before you try going live with it. So let me cancel my way out of here and tell you that that is pretty much how NTFS permissions work. Now that's for a file. If I were to back out here on the folder, if I go to Properties and go to Security, we have pretty much the same thing. But we have one additional permission that we didn't see on the file. And that is right here where it says List Folder Contents. Okay, you can't list folder contents of a file. The permission for listing folder contents means just that. You're giving permission for a user or a group to see the contents of this folder, even if they can't access it. Okay, so that's just what that one extra permission is. But everything else here is going to work exactly the same way. But now when we're looking at the folder, I will tell you that there is another tab here, and that's the Sharing tab. Now you can share this folder, and that means that you're making this folder accessible across the network. Okay, you're making it available from other computers, not just at this local computer. Now there's two ways to do this. One way is to click this Share button, which I will tell you straight out, I don't like doing. But if you click that Share button, you'll see here that you can pick user or group. Right? So pull down here is we can say everyone, or we can find specific people. Right? We go back here and put in the sales users again. And then we can choose whether their permission is read and write, or not at all. Right? We can just remove them if we want. Okay, so that's one way to share, but that is something that maybe regular users might do when sharing stuff on their home network. In a professional environment, as a network administrator, I'm going to use advanced sharing. And this is where I'm going to check the box and say that I want to share this folder. I can specify the name that I want to share the folder as. It doesn't have to be the name of the actual folder. You can give it an easier name to type in, maybe an easier name to understand, one that makes more sense to the users who are trying to connect to this folder. You can limit how many connections can be made to this folder at any given time. You can also set up specific permissions the same way we set up NTFS permissions, where you can add a particular user or group, right? So we'll add the sales users here. And then we can choose whether they have read access, whether they have change access, or full control. And again, just like with NTFS permissions, the rules, if you belong to multiple groups, is that is the least restrictive, with deny overriding all allows. But I need you to keep something in mind, and this is where it gets tricky. If a user was to connect to a file within a shared folder, right? So they connected from across the network. These permissions will decide what they can do across the network, but they still have to also have the appropriate permissions on the NTFS side. So it actually ends up becoming the more restrictive of the two. In other words, if we say that the sales users have full control permissions to the share, so I'll click OK and OK. So that means that this particular folder has been shared. Okay, so this folder can be accessed by the sales users across the network. But then this demo file, if we went back to that security tab and we took those same sales users, and you'll notice they only have modify permission, then that's all they're going to get. They're only going to get the modify permission because you have to have both the NTFS and shared permissions to be able to do things. And the same is true the other way around. If I were to go back here to the folder and go to those properties and go to sharing, go to advanced sharing, permissions, if I took those sales users and I said that the sales users had read only, now when those sales users connect to this folder across the network via the share, it doesn't matter that the properties of this file say that they should have modify. They're only going to have read-only access. The only way they're going to get this modify access is if they connect to it locally. If they actually come over to this computer and access this particular file. So that's another thing that you got to keep in mind when it comes to permissions. Now there is something that is very cool we'll say it's at least pretty cool. When it comes to Windows Server 2012, this is something new, and it's called access-based enumeration. Now, in order to enable this, we have to go into the Server Manager. So let me open up Server Manager now. And while this opens up all the way, let me explain to you what access-based enumeration is. This means that a user will only be able to see stuff in a shared folder that they have access to. If they don't have access to it, they won't even see it. And this is, I think, pretty cool, because in the old days, we used to talk about creating what's called hidden shares, which is a share that exists, but users can't see it there by default. They would only be able to get to it if they knew it was there. And the reason we did that is because if a user can't see it, then they don't know that it's there to try to hack into it. Well, that's what we're doing now, is we're making it that they won't even see stuff if they aren't supposed to be touching it. So if I come over here to File and Storage Services, and then I click on Shares, you'll see that I have my demo folder share. If I right-click and go to the properties of that share and go to the settings, there is a checkbox here for enabling access-based enumeration. And it explains it. Access-based enumeration displays only the files and folders that a user has permission to access. If a user does not have read or the equivalent permission to a folder, that should say file or folder, Windows will hide that file or folder from the user's view. This is pretty cool. Being able to stop users from seeing stuff that they're not supposed to be messing around with anyway is great, because once they see it, they start messing with it. And once they start messing with it, well, they could get lucky and they might actually get access to it. Now, as long as we're in this window right here, I'm going to show you something else. And that is, you'll notice there's a checkbox already checked that says allow the caching of the share. This is for something called offline sharing, or what was previously referred to as offline files. By checking this box, it means that users have the ability from a remote computer to choose to cache a local copy of the information that's in that shared folder. Great example of this would be if you had users on let's say a laptop, and maybe they're not always in the office. With that laptop, they could connect to the share while in the office, take a local copy of the files that they work with, and then let's say they go on a business trip, right? They leave the office, they're up on a plane, they don't have any access to the office servers, so how are they going to get access to the files they want to do some work on? Well, they can take that locally cached copy, open it up while they're on the plane and not connected to the server. They can make any changes they want to those files, and when they get back to the office and they connect back to the network, automatically those changes will get updated to the server. The only thing that I'm going to caution you on with this is that this was not designed for multi-user coordination and multi-user replication. In other words, if 2 or more users were to take the same file offline, right, do a locally cached copy, and they both went on that trip, right, we'll say 2 separate trips, right? You got 2 users, they go on 2 separate trips, each one making separate changes to the file, then they both come back to the office. All of those changes are not going to automatically get updated. One user is probably not going to be pretty happy, because what's going to happen is the first user is going to return from his or her trip, and automatically those changes will be updated to the server. Then the second user will return from his or her trip, and when they connect back to the network, they will get a little message saying, hey, I'm noticing that the original out on the server is not the same as what you originally cached on your computer. So what do you want to do? Do you want to make your changes updated on the server and get rid of those other changes? Or do you want to discard your own changes and keep that new file that's out on the server? Or do you want to do like a save as, where you keep both sets of changes but as 2 different files now? Well, what do you think is most likely going to happen? That user is going to say, hey, keep my changes. Forget that other stuff. And then that other user is going to be very unhappy that they did work for nothing. Okay, so that's the only thing I'll caution you on this caching of a share. Now there's one last thing that I want to show you before we wrap things up. Let me go ahead and cancel out of here, and I'm going to actually close out of the Server Manager. And I'm going to back out of here all the way back to our computer. And I want to show you something called shadow copies. And this is a great way to allow users to have backup copies of the files that they work on and these are copies that they can recover without you having to go to some kind of formal backup storage. So if we go to our E volume here, and let's right click and go to its properties, go to the Shadow Copies tab, I can take my E drive here and you'll see that it's disabled. We're going to go ahead and enable it. And what this is going to do is and it's telling you all about how it's going to use a default schedule of making copies of the data that's on here. I'm going to go ahead and just leave that, and we're going to go in and look at that schedule, but I'm going to click yes. And we've now done two things. First of all, it just made an actual copy right now, and it has a schedule. So if I highlight this and go to settings, there is a schedule here that you will see that at 7 a.m. on every Monday through Friday, and at noon every Monday through Friday, it's going to go ahead and create one of these shadow copies. Right? It's going to take a quick snapshot copy of all the data on this particular computer. Now we can go ahead and set up our own schedule if we want to. We also could go ahead and we can decide how much of this disk we will allow specifically for the storage of these backup copies, right? Because it's going to tie up space on the disk. And you'll see that by default it's using a limit of 1/10. In other words, we had a 75 gig volume here. It's doing 7.5 gig that it's willing to use for these shadow copies. And what happens is when that 7.5 gig gets full, what it'll do is it'll just take the oldest copy and delete it to make room for the new copy. Okay, so there's no worries as far as that goes. You just need to make sure you have enough space to keep at least one copy or however many copies you want of your data on that particular volume. So let's just go ahead and keep the defaults here, and I'm going to hit cancel. And I'm going to show you how this works, because this is pretty cool. I'm going to go into my E volume here. I'm going to go into the demo folder and take my demo file, and I'm actually going to open it. And I'm just going to simply type version 1. And I will close this and save the changes. To prove that these changes saved, I will open the file back up, and you can see it says version 1. So I'm going to close that. I'm going to back out to my volume here, go back into the properties, go into my shadow copies, and I'm going to go ahead and I have my E drive highlighted. I'm going to say create now. So I've gone ahead and I've just created an actual shadow copy of the information. I'll click OK, go back in here, open up my file. You'll see it still says version 1. No reason it wouldn't, right? So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to make this version 2. Close it, save changes. Sure enough, if I open it back up, it still says version 2. But I'm thinking to myself, I'm a user, and I go, no, wait, I didn't mean to overwrite that file. I didn't mean to do that. What I meant to do is I meant to do a save as, right? What I meant to do is I wanted to have version 2, but I wanted to call that a new file because version 1 I still need. What do? Well, in the old days, we'd go to our network administrator and say, hey, can you go recover that file from last night's backup or whatever? Well, all I need to do, as long as there was a shadow copy that was run at some point when it was still version 1, I can right-click on that file, go to Properties, go to the Previous Versions tab, and you'll see here that it's showing me that I have 2 versions that I can go to. And so if I go to the newer one, I can choose to restore it. As a matter of fact, even before I restore it, let me show you what I could do. I could open it just to see what I'm looking at and prove, aha, this is the one I want. This is version 1. Notice that if I would have gone to this older one and I clicked open, that was the blank one before we did anything. That's too old. We don't want that. We want version 1. Now there's 2 things we could do. We can either restore it, which I'm going to do just to show you. And it says, are you sure you want to restore it? And it'll say this will replace the current version. Yep, restore it. It's been restored. Click OK. Click OK again. If I open up this file, hey, we're back to version 1. Very cool, right? But the other thing that I could have done is I could have chosen to make a copy of it. This is like doing that save as. Okay, so if I wanted to, notice that this one, by the way, is the older one. If I click open, that's that blank one. If I wanted to go back to that one, but I didn't want to overwrite the new one because I really did want the new changes, I just wanted to do a save as, I could click copy and then go ahead and select the place where I want to put a copy of the file. And then I would have both of them. All right, so we're not going to do that here, but I just want to show you that you can do it. So that's another really cool thing that we can do when managing our files and folders. And so that does bring us to the end of this lesson where we have seen how to deal with things like permissions. I mean, that's a big thing when it comes to file services, making sure the right information is getting to the right people, or more specifically, it could also be that we don't get information that we don't want people to see. It doesn't get to those people. Okay, so that's really a major component when it comes down to implementing file services. Now, the other thing that I will mention is you may have noticed that things have not changed a whole lot from a concept perspective if you've worked with prior versions of Windows Server, but we do have some interface changes and a couple of new features. So that's pretty much all I have for you in this lesson. I will see you in the next one.